We're delighted to welcome you to the 14th Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol. It's a pleasure to present today Asia Vision 2021. Vivan Sharan, Mihir S, Parag Khanna and Shruti Rajgopalan in conversation with Sajjid Chinoy. The future belongs to Asia. An eastward shift in the economic center of gravity is steadily underway. But what is Asia? A diverse and politically fragmented continent with massive possibilities of production and utilization. What is a vision that will take this ancient, densely populated and culturally diverse region forward? Who will be the political and economic power steering global discourse? Can this be an Asia century? An expert panel of economists, policy strategists and researchers discuss the various implications of the present-day political climate vis-a-vis Asia. Vivan Sharan is a public policy thinker and entrepreneur based in New Delhi. He is a partner at the Cohen Advisory Group, Secretary of the Asia Center and visiting fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. He is the author of Wonged, India in Search of an Economic Ideology. Our next speaker, Mihir S, is Senior Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and Head of its Economy and Growth Program. In 2019, he co-edited What the Economy Needs Now with Abhijit Banerjee, Geeta Gopinathan and Raghuram Rajan. He is also a columnist for Bloomberg in New York and an Aspen Fellow. Our next speaker, Parag Khanna. Parag is a leading global strategy advisor, world traveler and best-selling author. He is founder and managing partner of Future Map, a data and scenario-based strategic advisory firm. Khanna's newest book is The Future is Asian: Commerce, Conflict and Culture in the 21st Century. He is author of a trilogy of books on the future of world order, beginning with the Second World, Empires and Influence in the New Global Order, followed by How to Run the World, Charting a Course to the Next Renaissance and Connectography, mapping the future of the global civilization. He is also the author of Future of the Global Civilization. He is also the author of Technocracy in the America, Rise of the Indo-State and co-author of Hybrid Reality, Thriving in the Emerging Human Technology Civilization. He was named one of the Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century and featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. Our next speaker, Shruti Rajgopalan. Shruti is a senior research fellow of the Indian Political Economy program at the MacArthur Center at the George Mason University and a fellow at the NYU School of Law. Dr. Rajgopalan writes The Impartial Spectator in Mint and is the host of the Ideas of India podcast. Our next speaker, Sajjid Chinoy. Sajjid is Managing Director and Chief Indian Economist at JP Morgan. He also serves as a member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. He was a member of the 15th Finance Commission's Advisory Council and has served on several committees instituted by the Reserve Bank of India. Sajjid has previously worked at the International Monetary Fund and McKinsey & Company. Please do remember to comment by typing into the comment section on your screens. Ladies and gentlemen, now presenting Asia Vision 2021, Vivan Sharan, Mihir S, Parag Khanna and Shruti Rajgopalan in conversation with Sajjid Chinoy. Enjoy the session.
You know, there's a growing chorus over the last decade that the 19th century was that of Europe, the 20th century belonged to North America, but the 21st century really is Asia's. And a recent report by McKinsey pointed out that, by 2040, Asian GDP would exceed 50% of global GDP. 50% of incremental consumer demand will come, in fact, from Asia. And as we all know, China's GDP is expected to be the largest in the world sometime over the next decade. So let me start with Parag. Parag, this is a topic close to your heart. You've written passionately about this, about why this is the Asian century. And you've also kind of spoken about the fact that we will see an Asianification of Asia. So A, what do you mean by that? And B, what makes you so excited about Asia's prospects in the coming decades and over the next century?
Well, thank you so much, Adit. It's so great to join this conversation. I'd like to think that in addition to writing passionately, which is, subjective, I'd like to think that I just wrote analytically about it. And I think it's important to make that distinction because a lot of people pontificate as to when and if and whether, Asia will be the center of the world's gravity. And it's not really up to those people, wherever they may sit, most likely, obviously, in a Western country, to decide, whenever they have their moment of enlightenment is not when the Asian century begins. Quite frankly, I was going to call the book The Present is Asian, but that obviously makes for a really ridiculous book title because the world already is Asian. It's demographically Asian, it's economically Asian, it's Asian in countless ways. And all that's required for the world to be Asianized, to get to your question, is that Asia needs to be further Asianized because Asia is already most of the world. Now, what we've seen for the last 30 years in particular, and I do mean exactly 30 years because it was 30 years ago that the Soviet Union collapsed, is that a variety of mechanisms, of processes have really accelerated in terms of intra-regional integration, or interdependence, I should say. I don't want to imply in any way that this is an inexorably peaceful process, because it isn't necessarily at all. However, it is one of deepening interdependence. You see it in commodities markets, industrial supply chains, the financial sector, capital flows, movements of people, infrastructure, obviously. In so many ways, you have seen that the biggest story of the last 30 years is literally the Asianization of Asia and the rise of Asia collectively at different speeds, a multi-speed, a multi-tiered Asia. And China is just one part of that. And to me, really, my biggest agenda was that we not have a Sino-centric view of Asia when you have 3+ billion Asians who are not Chinese. And of course, we're entering this fourth wave of Asian growth after Japan, after the Tigers, after China, and this fourth wave, of course, is centered on India and Southeast Asia, younger societies, pre-pandemic at least, having fast growth rates, and likely to be, again, another anchor or driver of the Asian future.
Thank you, Parag. That's a terrific start. Let me take this to Shruti and play devil's advocate just for a second, since I have the liberty to do so. And Parag spoke about the increased integration within Asia and the increased trade, but there's still a particular pattern to that trade. And the pattern is such that a lot of non-Chinese economies export intermediate goods to China, ranging from between 30 to 50% of their total exports. China then, exports final manufactured products to G3 economies. So in a way, China's prospects, despite the rebalancing, is still levered to the G3 economies. And to the extent that China is expected to slow in the coming, inevitably in the coming years and decades, that could provide some sort of headwinds for these other Southeast Asian economies. Added to that is the fact that perhaps, just perhaps in a post-COVID world, some of these supply chains get smaller and shorter, and this accentuates deglobalization. And then the third factor is what we often don't pay attention to is dependency ratios. Many parts of Asia are aging. And over the next 15 years, we will see a very big increase in dependencies. So given all of those, is there a risk we're overestimating Asia's potential? Could there be a surprise to the downside, Shruti?
The way I would think about this question is, I think there are sort of two parallelly running forces. If I were to invoke this in the sense of economists, there is one sense of, the Adam Smithian gains from trade, and the other are sort of, Schumpeterian gains from creative destruction, right? I think in the Smithian gains of trade contest, I think China is the clear winner, and it is very difficult to bypass China. I think Bangladesh has made, some headwinds in doing it somewhat successfully and actually striking better trade agreements, directly with the G3 countries and so on. The rest of South Asia, large parts of Asia are still a little bit behind, as you pointed out. The trade routes still run through China in some sense because of the nature of the manufacturing hub in China. Now, on the other side, in terms of Schumpeterian gains, if I were to think about technology, right, especially anything that has to do with network goods and network effects, right, there I think these other countries have a lot more leverage. So for instance, Netflix, despite the fact that India is much poorer than China, is going to have to make far more South Asian content because put together, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh are just more eyeballs, right? And in some sense, when it comes to network goods, the size of the market is the determining factor of the market, right? Gaining the market is competing for the entire market, not just in the market. So on those sorts of margins, another example of technology is machine learning, right? Machine learning, again, depends on literally the body count. So if you're thinking about something like how to do better laparoscopic surgeries, right, through computer adaptive technology, in those sorts of things, I mean, for every surgery that they do in the developed world, you do about 10 in India. right? So the future of growth in those kinds of technologies, machine learning, when it comes to data collection and information, I think in those sorts of areas, non-Chinese countries, especially those where the dependency ratios are better, which are younger, will have a sort of disproportionate say in the matter relative to their GDP per capita.
Thank you. Shruti, you brought up technology, and that's a good segue to Vivan. Vivan, for all practical purposes, we're in the midst of this fourth industrial revolution, a technological revolution. And the trade war, some would argue, between the US and China is simply a proxy for a technology war that's playing out. The question is, how is Asia poised to do in this revolution, in this technological revolution? One set of concerns that some folks have around the world is, even though Asia is great for replication and production of technology, maybe China still doesn't have expertise in foundational technologies. Is that a fair assessment, Vivan? And more generally, how is Asia poised to do in this next industrial revolution, so to speak?
Fair question, of course. If we think of tech as some sort of a silver bullet, which places Asia at par with the developed world, we have to think about whether that's really panning out. This type of thinking of tech as a silver bullet has already existed in India for a few years, particularly with digitalization, and intensified with COVID. The app economy, the provision of healthcare through applications and monitoring and surveillance and so on. This has actually led to a hardening of an impulse to make up for fundamental deficits in state capacity or even deindustrialization through digital and technology-led solutions. This is reflected in rhetoric around data as oil, or the notion, as I mentioned, that deindustrialization is no longer a problem since digitization is here to compensate. This is sort of akin to the Dutch disease, the discovery of natural gas in the Netherlands in the 1960s, which led to sort of deprioritization of other industrial sectors. The fact is that countries like India have lost 30 million white-collar jobs. They're not coming back anytime soon just through digitalization. Also, it reflects in a confusion of policy objectives linked to globalization of technology, which you mentioned, and the role of digital trade in regional integration. For instance, India has already walked out of the RCEP in 2019. It can come back, but one of the reasons for walking out was there's a digital trade chapter in RCEP, aside from, of course, emphasis on dairy and agri, where India feels uncomfortable. It's also not conceded to Japan's conceptualization of something called data free flow with trust under the G20, which was to create safe harbors for cross-border data flows and suggested under the Japanese presidency. But while the factors that have hardened India's digital and tech protectionism over the last few years are unique to it, I think the contradictions in an Asian vision on tech or digital are visible across the continent. So just to give you a few examples, take the example of Japan and South Korea that align on this free flow of data concept across borders, but have very different philosophies on how much control they exert over freedom of expression online. South Korea, for instance, pre-censors all its creative content online, whereas of course Japan is laissez-faire. Similar compulsions you see in countries like Vietnam and Singapore that are basically US allies but have very strong protections on speech online. Countries like China and Russia have taken strict controls on political speech at the level of infrastructure and so on. And India also seems to be taking a similar route, which is antithetical again to some of the democratic impulses that have shaped the country so far. India, again, to highlight yet another contradiction, aligns with the US, with Japan and Australia on national security perspectives on supply chains and electronics manufacturing and so on. But it's also on the other side of disputes that it has with the US, Japan, EU, all again sort of natural strategic partners as it builds out its strengths in Asia. At the WTO, where it's been alleged to flout obligations it has under the Information Technology Agreement of the WTO. So as it stands now, outside of the US allies, the traditional allies, the consensus in Asia seems to be to increase state control, surveillance, reduce political and creative freedom online, and do what it takes to localize supply chains. So very interest-led approach, not a values-led one. Moreover, Beijing seems to be at the center of power here still, with even in this new economy, while the US for instance, accounted for 45% of data flows in and out of China in 2001. That figure has dropped to 25% today. And Asian countries now make up more than half the total, particularly Vietnam at 17% and Singapore at 15%. So, there's a sort of concentration here. This is a vicious cycle because just as India looked at emulating China to erect barriers to catch up on the manufacturing piece, it's doing the same on digital to catch up on this sort of data democratization that has happened in China and so on and so forth. So what does all of this mean? I think the lack of Asian consensus on what models of trust to establish for digital trade is going to be problematic. But more importantly, the lack of consensus at the second tier of powers, which I think you alluded to, Sajjid, which need to combine strengths outside of China, and you still see a lack of a unifying vision. And it's not clear how state control and freedom of trade can coexist in digital, where the latter is more of a binary, because you can put fetters on digital much easier than you can in physical trade. It's an on and off switch at the level of, say, internet service provision and so on. So while technical knowledge needs to flow between countries, you need to come up with some sort of an ideological framework or a working framework for the second tier of powers in Asia to work on the fourth industrial revolution together. And perhaps not be confused by the Chinese model, because China, had this sort of first past the post, success in manufacturing, and closely followed by Vietnam, a country bombed to rubble just 40, 50 years ago. India didn't manage to catch up, and now it feels like it's missing out on the digital piece of the puzzle too. And so do other countries, by the way, which are similarly aligned to India in terms of the Chinese posture. So I think this confusion, this China envy mixed with state control, digital protectionism, and still the rise of China in digital despite its barriers, all confuse and muddle policy making and policy objectives in Asia. And a lot more needs to be done to pull us out of this, take a step back perhaps.
Mihir, as Parag was saying, Asia has been characterized by three growth miracles. You had Japan, you had the Asian tigers, you had China. Now, if Asia has to keep up those high growth rates going forward, the mantle will inevitably have to fall in South Asia. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Southeast Asia. I mean, South Asia, for instance, constitutes about 20% of Asian GDP in PPP terms. So how do you assess the prospects of South Asia, and how important will it be for this part of the region to integrate itself, either through physical or digital trade with the rest of the region?
Yeah, so thanks, Sajid. That's a great question. These three surges, in fact, of Asian growth that Parag referred to, I think that what we need to do in South Asia in particular, since you're asking about South Asia, is to step back and try and identify what do they have in common, what were the drivers, and so on and so forth. And I think that there were three things that we should look at here as underlying those spurts. The first, and we've known this for a couple of decades, in fact, since a bunch of economists decomposed that growth, did sort of forensic accounting and worked out what was responsible for that growth. The first thing that happened was that essentially there was an increase in what in economics they call factors of production, and you and I would call, basically the amount of labor that was employed, the number of people in the job market, the amount of capital that actually poured into those countries. And the biggest aspect of that increase in factor utilization in the Asian tigers in particular was the entry of women into the labor force, right? So we have to try and figure out, for example, whether that similar dynamic is happening in South Asia. And spoiler alert, it's not. We're actually going in the opposite direction. What was the second of these underlying factors in these surges for Asia in the past? Well, I think the second factor that we have to accept was that there was an increase in labor productivity. So the people who came into the market began to be more productive, began to earn more in a way, but also began to produce more. And are we prepared in South Asia, in India, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, for that kind of surge in labor productivity? And the answer is maybe, maybe not. One of the reasons why we should be a little skeptical that would apply here is that, for example, our educational attainment and our health and other social networks, our support systems are really not up to the caliber of even what they were in places like Korea, post-war Korea, which was otherwise devastated. We have, according to independent estimates of educational attainment in India in particular, we have a large proportion of our high school graduates who cannot actually cannot read or count even at class 4 level. And that's not the kind of labor force that is going to be able to maintain or to push this kind of surge that we saw in the rest of Asia. And what is the third aspect of this, which is, well, each of those previous tigers or surges or whatever you want to call them, each of the countries in those benefited from being closely integrated, closely tied to the global centers of growth of the past. Even Japan, back in the 60s, when it was rebuilding, when it was going through its own miracle period, was exporting to countries like the US, and at that point people were saying things like, oh, made in Japan is tacky, it's cheap, it's small cars and transistors. It's hard for us to think of that now, but the fact remains that without integration into the centers of global growth, it's very hard to picture how anyone could replicate these previous surges that Asia has shown. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, in South Asia in particular, how will we overcome the barriers that we currently have? One classic answer in India and South Asia has always been, oh, we'll leapfrog it somehow. 20 years ago, we used to say, we don't need manufacturing, we're a services economy. Now we say, oh, we don't need anything, we're a data economy. These sort of this magical thinking about the silver bullet that will cause us to develop in a different way than anybody ever has in history. Frankly, I don't think any of us should have a lot of time for. But the other more humble, more, somewhat greater humility and more real, more rational approach to these problems is to sit down and say, okay, we have these three barriers. Let's figure out how we can overcome them. And I think that if we just had a slightly cool head, even for the next 5 or 7 years, we could still be part of the next Asian surge. If we don't try and address these barriers, women in the workforce, low education, lack of integration with the world, then we will not be part of the next Asian surge. It's that simple.
Mihir alluded to this. This is the classic work by Alban Young in the 1990s and Paul Krugman, which deconstructed the tiger economies and found that a lot of it was just factor accumulation. And that's not a bad thing. It was labor force participation, as Mihir said. It was human capital accumulation. It was capital deepening more generally. And when you strip that all out, actual total factor productivity, TFP, wasn't that strong. Now, I guess my question going forward, Parag, is that's the sense you get as well, that in the services sectors of some of these economies in Asia, TFP growth, while it's disparate and heterogeneous, may not be the strongest. And to the extent that the global trading paradigm is going to change, we're going to move more to service-oriented global value chains. That's where the trading of the future lies. Is how prepared is Asia to compete globally in the services economy, and how prepared is Asia to up TFP growth once you exhaust factors of production?
Well, there's a great set of questions there and already very excellent comments that have been made that partially get at these answers. There's so many things I want to respond to in terms of what's already been said as well. First of all, poorer regions tend to have low levels of trade integration, so I don't think it's a terrible knock on either South Asia, which obviously has geopolitical obstacles as well, or even Southeast Asia. I live in this region of Southeast Asia, and for many years, people have said ASEAN's intra integration is so low. Well, of course it is. It's very poor. And as of course these economies grow, we're seeing that number rise. Is that percentage going to rise as a share of the region's total trade? Perhaps not, even as they get wealthier. Why? Because this region has also become a factory floor of the world, and it's participating very aggressively in open regionalism. It's trading with Japan, it's trading with China, it's trading with the United States, it's trading with Europe. So of course, also being an export powerhouse for the world is going to keep that internal intra level of trade low. So let's not get hung up too much on the percentages and look more at the trajectory of the overall figures, which is actually quite positive, right? So India, for example, for the reasons mentioned earlier, not joining RCEP. And it should be noted that all of the countries east of India, made a very warm statement saying that India is welcome to join at any time, but had its own reasons in terms of the extent to which IP and technology and digital is covered or not. But India does intend, again, pandemic notwithstanding, to reduce those trade deficits through look-east policy, through bilateral arrangements and so on. So long as we're seeing the volumes of trade grow, going back to the sort of Smithian approach, right? I think that is a generally positive sign. Now, in terms of the digital and technology and productivity, I want to put aside for a minute just productivity, simply because I think, as everyone ought to agree, we don't do a very good job of measuring productivity in light of the advent of low-cost digital services and the impact it has. Second point I'd like to make is that this is really not simply a replication of the tiger economy, era of the 70s and 80s, because unlike then, the majority of economies in this region are already services driven. So services to GDP is well over 50%, if not 60, 70% across the region. So in other words, much of the net new labor job creation in manufacturing industry, export related industries is coming to this region as a result of the wage arbitrage as China gets expensive and the new trade agreements and the geopolitical frictions. However, these economies are not nearly as dependent on it. Why? Well, because they've been urbanizing, right? Because they've been digitizing, because they've been financializing, all at the same time. I'm not going to use the word leapfrogs. I'll use it with the same cynical sort of, quotation marks as before. But I will say, though, that these add up to a lot of endogenous sort of growth, right? And the reason why we shouldn't necessarily view it as a linear trajectory in terms of the impact that the digitization has, and also the industrial work, is because so much is coming or being generated through foreign investment, right? And with that, what we see with the factories in Vietnam or even in Thailand is that the kind of factory, the future model, some of the latest technology from Europe, from the United States, with 5G, IoT, and so forth, is coming right here to some of the poorer countries. So we are going to see a pretty substantial increase in the efficiency of output, and we're going to see reverse exports flourish back into China, ideally, if China holds up its end of the bargain. We're certainly going to see more foreign investment into the region from Europe and from the United States. So I think that if you take all these things together, you can continue to formulate a fairly positive picture about the region, irrespective of what specific statistical measures that are quite, I would say, again, conventional and outdated would tell us.
Thank you, Parag. That's really interesting. Let me just shift a little bit to geopolitics and turn to Shruti to ask, ultimately, one key risk for this region is, the great power battle between the US and China that's ongoing, and what the collateral impact of that might be in other countries in the region. You see many Asian economies with deep economic linkages to China, and yet many of them are reliant on the US for security. So they're walking this fine line. So I guess, how big a threat is the US-China trade/technology conflict? And what can the rest of Asia do to kind of insulate itself from this?
To be honest, I think the geopolitics can shift quite rapidly in a way that supply chains and trade relationships don't quite shift as quickly. So I think there's always a lag. Now, that can be both a good thing and a bad thing, in the sense that you could be involved in negotiating certain, or almost in a trade war on certain margins if it comes to intellectual property, and you could still be getting your microchips supplied from the same country. It's just a completely different sector. It's a different group of vendors. It's different interest groups, right? So I think we often make more of the trade relationship than there is, because at the end of the day, everyone only wants to buy from someone who's competitive, right? So the trade war gets into the picture, the geopolitics comes into the picture only if it's actually going to lead to higher tariffs in some sense, right? And a lot of times that doesn't happen. And even if it leads to higher tariffs, it's maybe in one or two areas where the trade war is ongoing. Everything does not become more expensive, right? So I think the only way to deal with the geopolitics strategically is to deal with it as if it doesn't exist. It is to be cheap and competitive. As Mihir pointed out, India's biggest problem has been that it is not competitive on any margin. Now, let's come to the point that Mihir mentioned about services. 20 years ago, it was services, now it's data. Services is no silver bullet. And that's true on two margins. So one is, for services to be the driver of an economy, India has a slight advantage because it's a very large economy, right? So once again, the size of the number of people matters here. South Korea can get away only by exporting human hair. India can also get away by having a lot of people cutting hair because you can't export a haircut while you can export hair, right? So there are some advantages that India has over South Korea or Bangladesh or Pakistan. But even then, the services has a cap. For services to be competitive and for the economy to be driven by services instead of in terms of having a pull effect on incomes, especially of the poorest groups, either the most productive people need to generate such Schumpeterian gains that you can redistribute and pull everyone in the economy. Barring that, everyone needs to provide their services cheaper and become extremely competitive. So I think the big problem in India is when we talk about services 20 years ago or when we talk about data now, there's a certain kind of elitism. There's almost as if India has this aversion to saying we will supply the world goods for cheap. Nobody wants to make that statement. And frankly, every single success story we've had in the world, South Korea, Vietnam, China, they basically made their bones by providing the world things way cheaper than anyone else. And of course, as it's been pointed out before, they got tagged as, bad products, bad design, cheap quality. But at the end of the day, that's really what their growth trajectory was. So unless we get cheaper, I think, the geopolitics can help on certain margins, hurt on minor margins, but it can't do too much. The real problem is this anti-competitiveness, which is inbuilt in South Asian economies because of factor markets.
Yeah, and as you said, the cheapness is a byproduct of productivity gains. And to underscore the point you made, no, emerging market has grown at 7-8% for a decade without relying on exports. So we'll have to, ultimately export our way, whether it's goods or services. I think we can be agnostic about that. But Vivan, let me just take that trade point to you, just to round off the earlier discussion. So what does a Biden presidency really mean for Asia, right? To the extent that there is a renewed focus on multilateralism or rules-based international order, that should augur well for Asia, right? You should see trade prospects rise, investment prospects rise, or do you think that gets swamped again by this U.S.-China narrative?
Tough question, but I think, just to framing of this discussion, which I think is based on Parag's concept of 4 Asias, I think you see many more Asias within each country now, and it's getting starker with COVID. So you have multi-speed economies with multi-speed recoveries, and that really impacts the level of nationalism or protectionism within different constituencies and different countries. So to the extent that the Biden administration can bite the bullet and engender another or recast the pivot to Asia in a much stronger mold, it'll find it hard to navigate these headwinds. So just as an example, I think over the last 10 years, Japan's total ODA or overseas development assistance to India is in the ballpark of about $10 billion, which is significant. And most of that has been for regional connectivity projects and so on, as you know. But the US has committed just under $1 billion, around $800 million in the same period. Now, the US cannot hope to continue to bank on the exportability of its economic and cultural model to convince this heterogeneous bunch of people in countries like India that their political, economic aspirations are aligned with America's vision for the world. And this gets further complicated with the immersive ubiquity of technology as we know it, where these fragmented groups of people find it very hard to to navigate and become coherent in their demands of accountability or outcomes from their governments. And they're easily influenced by commercial and political influence operations and so on and so forth. This means that political monopolies in Asia will also get harder to break with the adoption and dissemination and diffusion of technology that comes with this foreign direct investment and fourth industrial revolution. Is the US prepared to sort of counteract some of these things with hard investments through the pivot to Asia is a question that really is something that is somewhat of an open one. And their commitment will have to be much harder than it has been so far, because, like I said, the exportability of the model is more under question today than it ever has been. And if digital is any indication of that, where you see that the Asian model really in digital is very distinct from the US model, despite the fact that impulses within Asia of democracy, etc., the second tier of powers still holds. So this contradiction is hard to reconcile, perhaps without an external push or a nudge that helps rebalance some of these asymmetries or inconsistencies.
Mihir, I just want to turn to you, and we've spoken about all the risks, but let's just appreciate some of the positives here. We're just coming off a once in a century pandemic, and you just have to look at Asia's performance versus the rest of the world. One way to measure that is to look at cumulative number of deaths per million. Asia is about 27 deaths per million last I checked. Latin America is 1150. Emerging Europe is 705. Developed economies are 1100, right? These are orders of magnitude better in Asia. And some would argue that this is, just better state capacity in Asia, generally, greater public trust, greater social cohesion. And folks like Kishore Mahbubani say that, in a way, this kind of hastens the power shift to Asia, that this just reveals the Asian century has already begun. How would you explain this very different performance of Asia in the pandemic, and what is the signal about the future?
Thanks, Sajjid. I think that this is going to be one of the sort of great questions going forward. What explained Asia's outperformance? Because I don't think it can be just state capacity. Some societies, some countries definitely had more effective states. Others that did not. Pakistan's have also done well. It can't merely be trust, because I think that if you look at various scores or surveys of trust, whether in the government or in other social institutions, they vary widely across countries in Asia that have all done very well. None of these explanations are completely satisfactory. Maybe it's an interaction of several factors, including favorable demographics, early shutdowns, we don't know. And I think that we should be, as far as possible, considerably more agnostic than Mr. Mahbubani has been, and not jump to a conclusion about what it means and what it could imply. That said, what does it mean going forward? I think that here we have to recognize that it's not just about about the human cost, which fortunately much of Asia has escaped. But it is, as Vivan said, about the two-track recovery. And two-track recovery, not just in terms of economic, of how swiftly we're getting back to a normal GDP, but also in terms of how close you return to a pre-pandemic potential GDP. Because in some countries, I think we may be at a permanently lower path. How quickly you can reintegrate into the world in terms of tourism. There are some countries which may take 2, 3 years, 4 years in order to be fully open for business. So there is a significant, a disadvantage that a lot of Asia will face going forward. And we don't know how much that is, where it's going to be. We don't know how it's going to play out. So I think I would just like to beg for a little humility here. I've heard this argument a lot, that it's demonstrated, the pandemic has demonstrated X, it's demonstrated Y, it's demonstrated damn all. We're still in the middle of it, we don't know what's going to happen. All right, so please shut up, everybody.
Point well taken. We'll wait for the history books to tell us more. Shruti, I know you had something to say on this.
So, I absolutely agree with Mihir that, we're in the middle of this. We're still going through the data that are coming in, and it's hard to say conclusively one way or another. And what I want to say is this is not to take away from some of the Asian successes. Yes, there were some decisive decisions taken and some demographic advantages. But one slightly counterintuitive thing that I would like to point out is that a lot of the richer countries where the fatality rates were very high, one possible reason is also that these countries have better healthcare systems. So they are much better at keeping people alive longer despite their comorbidities. Right. So one of the things that is driven, in these countries, that there's very high rates of death amongst the elderly with a lot of comorbidities. You don't see that in some of the poorer countries and some of the Asian countries, because frankly, the circumstances don't allow them to live up to that point. Right. And in Asian countries or poorer countries, people who do make it past that point are more robust. Right. So there is this, what they call survivorship bias. I believe, Anup Malani and some other people have written about this. So I think this is something we must keep in mind when it comes to the developed world. One of the reasons Italy had so many deaths is its healthcare system allows a lot of people who are above 75 to survive with heart disease and diabetes and high blood pressure and so on and so forth. And I think on that margin, a lot of humility is required, and we must take care to make huge investments in, healthcare in Asian countries, especially now that we're younger. There will come a time, when these populations also age and impose an enormous stress on the healthcare system. So the time to make those investments is now. And I think it's too soon to do the victory lap on, us fighting COVID and driving it away with slogans and, bartans and things like that. So I think we need to be careful.
No, point well taken. There are many factors at play, and we'll have to carefully disentangle this, many years after the fact. I've been told I have a couple of minutes, so let me take final comments from Parag and Vivan. Parag, just to step back on the geopolitics here, because in the last couple of years, you've seen fair number of territorial and maritime disputes in the region. Do you think that the geopolitical pressures are the biggest risk to this Asian century?
Not necessarily. I think on the one hand, from a sort of, in terms of the backdrop, yes, all of the major World War III scenarios are here in Asia. There's no important or, systemically relevant, let's say, international boundary dispute anywhere else in the world, not even Russia, Crimea, right? That's in any case pretty much done. Crimea is not, Ukraine is not getting it back. So, I track 8 or 9 major conflict situations here in Asia proper, and any one of them could blow up. But the difference between Asia and, say, Europe is that, this is not a claustrophobic region. Each of these tensions and dilemmas has its, unique historical origins, certainly pre-legal in the sense of pre-modern international law, pre-colonial in many instances. And they're quite far apart from each other. So you could have, the India-China border situation. You could have the South China Sea, Taiwan, Senkaku Islands, North Korea. Each of these is quite distinct. I don't foresee some kind of 1914 Europe chain reaction pattern. All of Asia suddenly glows up in smoke simply because, one of these conflicts breaks out, right? And one of them will, inevitably, of course. We've been lucky for the last 30 years that Asian powers have pursued the kind of geo-economic course of, again, convergence, and kept the geopolitics suppressed. But we really won't be so lucky. One of these is going to explode. Does that derail the entire Asian story? I really don't think it does, right? Because one of the things to remember, again, as you said, step back. Well, let's step back and be very blunt about it. Conflicts come and go. And when they're over, there's a settlement. There's a winner and a loser. It's unfair, but there is ultimately a resolution. And after that resolution, countries move on. And they carry on building the Silk Roads between each other. You think about the Balkans in the 1990s versus the Balkans today. So, if it happens, it happens. It's unfortunate. The broader point is that I think that for Asian powers to be taken seriously on the global diplomatic stage, beyond just their individual clout, but collectively, they should demonstrate a lot more diplomatic maturity. They shouldn't require the United States to break up a spat dating back to World War II between Japan and South Korea, two, quite frankly, far more mature and effective democracies than America is. It's quite frankly embarrassing for the Japanese and the Koreans, and I wish that they would see it that way. So I think each and every one of these, potential flashpoints has a potential, has a obvious, actually, literally an obvious resolution and solution, including India, China, of course, by the way. And it remains up to Asian powers to demonstrate the statesmanship to resolve them. And if we can, one by one, I think that will reinforce the case for the Asian century.
Thanks, Parag. I've been told that time's completely out. This has been a terrific panel. I think we've barely scratched the surface. We could go on for another hour easily, but I've been told that that's it.
Thank you Vivan Sharan, Mihir Sharma, Parag Khanna, Shruti Rajgopalan and Sajjid Chinoy for this fantastic conversation. We thank our celebration partners, Diageo. Thank you all for watching and being such a great audience. Please stay logged on to continue to watch with us the series of exciting sessions featuring a stellar list of speakers that have been specially curated for you. As you're aware, the cultural sector has been critically impacted by the pandemic, and while we have braced ourselves to embrace the new normal, we have struggled to ensure that we can continue to bring you a free flow of knowledge and ideas. We would love for you to support us at Teamwork Arts. Any contribution is welcome and would help spread knowledge and ideas seamlessly against all odds. Please tweet using hashtag Jaipur Literature Festival 2021 @Jaipur Lit Fest. The festival is protected by Dettol. Hope to see you in the next session.